The sun was barely beginning to set over the quiet streets of Florida when the disappearance of 20-year-old Emma Lawson would mark the beginning of a case that would leave the community in shock. Emma, a bright and outgoing college student, had been living in the small coastal town for a few years, working part-time at a local cafe while studying criminal justice. She had dreams of becoming a detective, of solving cases just like the ones she read about in her textbooks. Little did she know that she would soon become the focus of one. Emma had always been the type of person who made friends easily. She was well known and liked by almost everyone in town. Her bubbly personality and infectious laugh made her the center of attention at social gatherings. People described her as the girl who always made sure no one felt left out. But beneath her friendly exterior, Emma had her secrets. On the evening of her disappearance, Emma had been at a local bar with a few friends. The group had celebrated a birthday, enjoying drinks and laughing over shared memories. She'd called her mother around 10 p.m. that night to let her know she was on her way home. It was the last time anyone would hear from her. Emma's sudden disappearance left the small town reeling. Her family, particularly her mother, Karen Lawson, was distraught. Emma had no known enemies, and her disappearance didn't fit any of the patterns of typical runaway cases. This was no ordinary missing persons case. There was something far more sinister at play. In the days that followed, the local police began to investigate Emma's last known whereabouts, piecing together fragmented clues from the night she vanished. There were conflicting reports from friends who were with her, some recalling that she'd been in good spirits, while others mentioned that she'd seemed uneasy before leaving the bar. One thing was clear: Emma had vanished without a trace. The morning after Emma Lawson was reported missing, the air in Florida seemed to hang with a thick, oppressive silence. What had begun as a routine case of a missing person quickly escalated into something much more complex and troubling. Detective Lucas Rivera, a seasoned investigator with over 15 years of experience, was assigned to the case. Despite the typical initial hesitance of small-town law enforcement, there was no denying the gravity of the situation. Emma's disappearance wasn't an accident. Something more was at play. Rivera arrived at the Lawson family home early that morning, where he was greeted by Emma's mother, Karen. Her eyes were bloodshot from crying, and her voice trembled as she recounted the night before. "She wouldn't just leave us," Karen said, clutching a framed photograph of her daughter. "She was always so responsible. This isn't like her." Karen's distress was palpable, and Rivera couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. For a mother to look so lost, so desperate for answers, it wasn't something Rivera took lightly. He assured Karen that they would find her, but even as the words left his mouth, he felt the doubt creeping in. His gut told him this case wasn't as simple as a runaway or a forgotten detour. The first step was to canvass the area. Rivera and his team began their search at the local bar where Emma had been the night before. The bartender, a young woman named Lisa, confirmed that Emma had been there with a group of friends, but she had left alone, something that wasn't unusual. It wasn't uncommon for patrons to call it a night early and leave the bar by themselves. But there was something strange about Emma's departure. Lisa mentioned that Emma had appeared agitated before leaving, like she was looking for someone, or perhaps trying to avoid someone. With this new information, Rivera shifted his focus. He began to interview Emma's friends, trying to piece together any odd interactions or suspicious behavior. But all they could tell him was what he already knew. Emma had been in good spirits for most of the night and nothing seemed off. The friends had lost sight of her just before she left. No one had seen her walk out the door, nor did anyone remember her getting into a car. The next stop was Emma's apartment. It was small but cozy, filled with the warmth of a young woman starting out in life. Rivera spent hours combing through her belongings, looking for anything out of the ordinary: text messages, social media activity, or signs of forced entry. There was nothing. Everything appeared normal, as if Emma had simply vanished into thin air. But as the investigation dragged on, the pressure began to mount. The town was buzzing with rumors, and the police were under increasing scrutiny. The media picked up the story, turning the case into a sensation. Local news outlets covered it obsessively, and the hashtag Find Emma Lawson trended on social media. The pressure on Rivera and his team only grew stronger. Then came the break, a chilling one. A surveillance camera at a nearby convenience store had captured Emma's car leaving the bar parking lot at approximately 11:15 p.m. that night. However, the footage only showed the car from behind. The footage didn't show who was driving. The car then turned left onto the main highway, but after that, it disappeared. It was a dead end. Rivera and his team knew they had to act quickly. They contacted local tow yards and reviewed footage from other traffic cameras, hoping for a clearer view of the car's destination. Finally, after days of searching, they found another security camera, this one positioned outside a gas station on the outskirts of town. It was here that they saw something that made the hairs on the back of Rivera's neck stand up. Emma's car was clearly visible on the footage, but what was even more disturbing was the second car that followed closely behind her. It wasn't a car Emma was known to drive or associate with, and there was no record of it in her social media activity or among her acquaintances. The car was dark-colored, and the driver's face was obscured by the shadows of the night. The discovery of the second vehicle led Rivera to dig deeper into the town's local networks. Was Emma being stalked? Was this an isolated incident, or was someone targeting her? Rivera couldn't rule out the possibility of foul play. With this new lead in hand, the investigation began to take on a darker tone. Rivera put out a request for any information regarding the car and its owner, hoping the community might have seen something that could shed light on who was behind Emma's disappearance. The case that had seemed like just another missing person was now spiraling into a web of uncertainty and fear. The small town, once peaceful and quiet, was now a place of suspicion and tension. The days stretched on, and as the police followed every lead, they found themselves asking one painful question: was Emma still alive? The possibility that she could be out there, somewhere, terrified and in danger, weighed heavily on everyone involved. As the investigation into Emma Lawson's disappearance intensified, Detective Lucas Rivera and his team began to focus on the growing list of potential suspects. While the case initially appeared to be one of those random disappearances, the mounting evidence, especially the surveillance footage, began to suggest otherwise. With the discovery of the mysterious dark-colored car following Emma, the investigation quickly shifted toward the theory that someone may have been actively involved in her vanishing. The first step in narrowing down the suspects was to interview Emma's friends and acquaintances. Emma had lived a fairly public life in the small town, and the list of people who knew her seemed endless. Everyone had a theory about who might want to harm her or what might have happened to her. One of the first suspects that emerged was Kyle Stevens, Emma's ex-boyfriend. Kyle, a local mechanic, had been in an on-and-off relationship with Emma for over 2 years. According to Emma's friends, their breakup had been less than amicable. Kyle had been heartbroken, and there were rumors that he had never truly accepted the end of their relationship. Though he had no criminal record, several people noted that he had a volatile temper and had once shown signs of possessiveness towards Emma. When Rivera interviewed Kyle, he seemed cooperative, but his nervous behavior raised suspicions. He couldn't provide a solid alibi for the night Emma went missing, and when questioned about their breakup, his answers seemed evasive. "It wasn't a bad breakup," Kyle insisted when asked if he had been upset with Emma. "We just weren't right for each other. I didn't even think about her after that." Despite his calm demeanor, Rivera couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. However, Kyle wasn't the only person on Rivera's radar. As more time passed, other possible suspects began to emerge, complicating the investigation. Another person of interest was Rachel Green, Emma's close friend. Rachel had been with Emma at the bar the night she disappeared. During the initial investigation, Rachel had been one of the first people to express concern over Emma's absence. But as Rivera continued his interviews, he learned that Rachel had been hiding a few key details. It seemed that Rachel had been involved with someone much older, a man named Andrew West, who had a known history of manipulative and controlling behavior. Rachel's relationship with Andrew had been kept a secret from most of their friends, and Rivera couldn't help but wonder if Rachel's loyalty to Andrew had anything to do with Emma's disappearance. He had learned that Rachel had been texting Andrew late that night, shortly before Emma's last known phone call. According to her, it was just a casual conversation. But Rivera knew that some friendships were built on secrets, and he couldn't ignore the possibility that Rachel had more to hide. Yet it was the dark car that followed Emma on the security footage that became the center of attention. The fact that the car had followed Emma for miles raised alarm bells. Rivera believed this wasn't a random act of violence, but a calculated plan. The question was, who was behind the wheel of that car and why were they targeting Emma? As the investigation progressed, Rivera expanded his search to include anyone who might have been in the area on the night of Emma's disappearance. The list of possible suspects seemed to grow longer with every lead. Emma had been friendly with almost everyone in town, making it difficult to pinpoint a potential aggressor. Rivera also considered the possibility that the suspect might not even be local. The small town of Florida wasn't known for much crime, but stranger crimes had happened before. Rivera decided to delve deeper into Emma's social media accounts. While she hadn't posted anything unusual recently, Rivera found one detail that caught his attention. Emma had received several direct messages from an anonymous account in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The messages were odd, some even unsettling. They spoke of meeting soon and not being able to wait any longer. At first glance, they appeared harmless enough, but after Rivera brought in a cyber expert to trace the IP addresses, the results were chilling. The messages had been sent from a location within the town. This discovery sent a ripple of unease through the investigation. The anonymous account could only mean one thing. Emma had been in contact with someone who knew her on a more intimate level, someone who might have been monitoring her movements. Who could this person be? And why had they targeted her? With the revelation of the messages, Rivera realized that the case was spiraling into something much darker than he had initially anticipated. The more he uncovered, the less he knew about the real motive. He knew that the person responsible for Emma's disappearance wasn't some random stranger. They were someone who knew Emma, someone who understood her habits, her schedule, and most importantly, someone who had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to act. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation seemed to stall. But Rivera was relentless. He couldn't afford to let the case slip through his fingers. Every lead, no matter how small, was worth following. He continued to dig into the backgrounds of people who had come into contact with Emma recently, and with every new interview he started to see the puzzle pieces coming together. Emma's life, as it turned out, had been far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Beneath the smiles and the friendly demeanor, there had been signs of tension, of hidden conflicts, and a growing sense of unease. Rivera was determined to find out who was behind Emma's disappearance, and more importantly, why they had taken her. Theories swirled around the case: jealous exes, hidden enemies, even a potential stalker. But Rivera couldn't ignore the fact that, in the end, someone close to Emma was the key to unraveling the mystery. The investigation was far from over, but Detective Rivera was closing in on the truth. And he knew one thing for sure: the shocking truth about Emma Lawson's disappearance was out there, waiting to be discovered. Detective Lucas Rivera had been working tirelessly on Emma Lawson's case, but the frustration was beginning to mount. Weeks had passed since Emma's disappearance, and despite numerous leads, interviews, and even a few promising pieces of evidence, there was still no breakthrough. Every lead seemed to fade into nothingness, leaving Rivera to wonder if the case would ever be solved. But as often happens in investigations, just when it seemed like the case was about to stall completely, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. It was a quiet Monday morning when Rivera received the call that would change everything. The voice on the other end of the line was from a local tow truck driver, Charlie Hart. He had been reviewing footage from his company's cameras when something caught his eye. One of his trucks had towed a car in the early hours of the morning on the day Emma went missing. The car was parked in an isolated area near the outskirts of town, just a few miles from where Emma's car was last seen on the surveillance footage. What Charlie had noticed was the car in question, dark-colored and nondescript, was identical to the one seen following Emma's car that night. It wasn't much, but it was the kind of lead that could set the wheels of the investigation in motion again. Rivera wasted no time. He drove to the tow yard and met with Charlie to review the footage. The grainy video footage wasn't perfect, but there was enough to make out the car's features. It had distinctive bumper damage that matched the report from the convenience store security camera. The car had been towed around 3:30 a.m., just hours after Emma's last known whereabouts. It was parked in a secluded area near a small, abandoned building that was notorious for being a hangout for troublemakers. There was no immediate indication that anyone had been in the car, but it was now the prime focus of the investigation. Charlie, who had no idea who the car belonged to, provided Rivera with the location of the tow. The abandoned building was off a dirt road that ran parallel to the highway. It wasn't a place people frequented, and there were no businesses around for miles. The area was quiet, almost desolate, a perfect place to hide or dispose of something, or worse, someone. Rivera organized a team to search the area. The building was old, with boarded-up windows and graffiti scattered across the walls. It looked as though no one had used it in years. But as the team began to sift through the debris inside, they found something that would change the course of the investigation. Hidden in a corner behind a stack of old wooden pallets, they found a black duffel bag. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than discarded luggage, but upon closer inspection, Rivera noticed something odd: a distinct, damp smell coming from inside the bag. When they opened it, they discovered a set of clothes that appeared to belong to Emma: her favorite jacket, a pair of jeans, and her shoes. The clothes were covered in dirt, and there was an unmistakable stain on the sleeve of the jacket. It looked like blood. The discovery was both chilling and validating. It confirmed what Rivera had suspected all along, that Emma had been attacked. But what really struck him was the timing. The bag had been left there after Emma's disappearance, and the place where it was found was eerily close to the location where Emma's car had been last seen. Whoever had left those clothes there wanted them to be found, but more importantly, it suggested that Emma had been close to the area before she was taken. With this new piece of evidence, the team expanded their search, hoping that the surrounding area might hold other clues. They canvassed the area thoroughly, checking for any signs of struggle or discarded items. It wasn't long before they found another disturbing piece of evidence. Hidden behind a broken fence just a few hundred yards from the building. It was a cell phone, its screen cracked and covered in dirt. When Rivera picked up the phone, his heart skipped a beat. It was Emma's phone. His mind raced. Why had it been left here? Why hadn't the kidnapper disposed of it, or better yet, used it to throw off the investigation? Rivera's immediate thought was that the person responsible wanted to send a message. The phone's location confirmed that Emma had been taken to this area, and whoever had done it had been careful to leave no trace of themselves behind. The phone was sent to forensics for examination, but Rivera didn't need to wait long to know what it would reveal. In the meantime, the discovery of the duffel bag and the phone brought renewed hope to the investigation. With the police now having a better understanding of where Emma had been, they returned to the abandoned building to conduct a more thorough search. This time they found something even more significant: footprints. The footprints, which appeared to be from a heavy boot, led away from the building and down a trail that wound through the trees. Rivera's team followed the trail, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The footprints led them to a small, secluded clearing, where they found more evidence. A large metal container had been left behind, partially covered with leaves and branches. Inside the container were several items that seemed out of place: a bundle of rope, duct tape, and most disturbingly, a bloody knife. The knife was taken into evidence and sent to the lab for analysis. The team also began to track the origins of the footprints. They followed the trail through the woods and eventually out onto a back road that led toward an area just outside of town. The further they ventured, the more they felt the oppressive weight of the case. Someone had been trying to cover their tracks, but Rivera was getting closer. With the phone in hand and new evidence pointing toward someone familiar with the area, Rivera knew that the breakthrough they had been waiting for was finally here. The investigation was gaining momentum, and the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. But even with all the new evidence, Rivera knew the hardest part was still ahead: finding the person responsible for Emma's abduction and uncovering the truth. Detective Lucas Rivera was no stranger to the painstaking nature of investigations, but the case of Emma Lawson was starting to feel like an endless maze with no clear exit. Every new piece of evidence, every new lead seemed to open a new door, but as soon as they entered, it led to another dead end. The search had expanded far beyond the initial boundaries of town, and the pressure to find Emma, or at least her abductor, was mounting with each passing day. With the discovery of Emma's phone, the bloody knife, and the duffel bag containing her clothes, Rivera had hoped the case would break wide open. But now he was faced with a multitude of questions that had no immediate answers. Who had left these items behind and why? Was Emma still alive? And most importantly, where was she? Rivera knew the key to unraveling this mystery lay in finding the missing pieces: the witnesses who had seen something, the details that had been overlooked, and the connections that hadn't yet been made. But as the investigation entered its 6th week, the leads were becoming fewer and more fragmented. The team had followed up with everyone they could think of: friends, family, and neighbors, but the truth remained elusive. Then came a breakthrough in the form of a witness. A woman named Gina Mitchell, who had been walking her dog near the abandoned building on the night Emma went missing, came forward with information that seemed too crucial to ignore. Gina had been reluctant at first, unsure of what she had seen, but after hearing about the recent developments in the case, she decided to speak up. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Gina explained, sitting across from Rivera at the local police station. "It was late and I was just out for my usual walk. My dog started acting up, pulling at the leash, and when I looked down the trail near the old building, I saw a car parked. It wasn't Emma's car, but there was something strange about it. I thought I saw a figure in the back seat, but I couldn't tell who it was. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now..." Her voice trailed off, and Rivera felt a wave of excitement mixed with frustration. "When did you see the car?" Rivera asked, trying to focus her memory. "It was around 10:30 or 11 o'clock that night. I know it was close to when Emma was last seen at the bar, but I didn't realize it was important until now. I didn't think to write it down or tell anyone. But now I know I should have." Her statement added another layer to the mystery. The fact that she had seen a car parked near the scene of Emma's disappearance, and potentially someone inside it, could not be ignored. The timeline was now becoming clearer. Emma had left the bar around 10:15 p.m., and Gina had seen this car around 10:30 p.m., just a few miles from where Emma's car had been captured on surveillance footage. The pieces were starting to fit, but the question remained: who had been in the car? Rivera knew the next step was to track down the car. He enlisted the help of his team to search for any records of a vehicle that matched Gina's description. While there were no immediate matches from the local databases, Rivera's gut told him that they were close. The dark-colored car that had been tailing Emma's vehicle seemed to be linked to this mysterious car, and the timing was just too coincidental to ignore. Meanwhile, the search for Emma's whereabouts continued. Teams scoured the woods and surrounding areas, looking for any sign of her. As days turned into weeks, however, the physical search seemed to reach an impasse. The area was vast, and despite the presence of the phone and other items, there was no concrete evidence that could directly lead them to Emma's location. The investigation also uncovered an unsettling fact. Emma's phone had been used after she went missing. This revelation sent shockwaves through the team. Forensics had discovered that her phone had been turned on several times after the night she was last seen. It had pinged off several towers, each location further away from the town. It was clear now that whoever had taken her had been trying to cover their tracks, but the fact that Emma's phone had been used suggested one important thing: she was still alive. This was both a relief and a curse. If Emma was alive, there was still hope. But the realization that her abductor was actively using her phone meant that the investigation was now more urgent than ever. Rivera quickly shifted focus to the phone's usage patterns. Every time the phone was used, it left a digital trail, and Rivera was determined to follow it. With the help of a cyber expert, he began to track the phone's activity. Each location was logged and mapped, leading them on a path that stretched across several counties. It was clear the abductor had been moving with purpose, carefully avoiding any area that might lead back to them. The trail, though faint, was there. In the midst of this, Rivera was contacted by the local pawn shop owner, who had seen a strange individual attempting to sell a large amount of cash in exchange for a gold watch, a watch that was unmistakably Emma's. The pawn shop owner had remembered Emma from her visits to the store to purchase gifts for family members. This lead was more than just a clue; it was a direct link to the person who had Emma's possessions, possibly Emma herself. With a new focus on this lead, Rivera and his team worked quickly to piece together the details. They scoured the pawn shop's surveillance footage and, after a few tense days, managed to identify the man who had tried to sell the watch. His name was Derek Hayes, a local drifter with a criminal record. Hayes had been in and out of trouble for years, though his past crimes had been relatively minor. Still, his connection to Emma's watch could not be ignored. Rivera knew they were getting closer, but he also knew that the clock was ticking. Emma's fate hung in the balance, and every minute they wasted could cost her life. The breakthrough with the pawn shop was a piece of the puzzle, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Who was Derek Hayes working with? Was he the one who had taken Emma, or was he simply a pawn in a larger scheme? As the investigation into Emma Lawson's disappearance deepened, the sense of urgency in the small town of Florida grew palpable. Weeks had passed, and every lead seemed to create more questions than answers. But just as hope was beginning to fade, the break the detectives had been waiting for arrived in the form of a shocking twist. A twist that would change the course of the investigation entirely. Detective Lucas Rivera and his team had been zeroing in on Derek Hayes, the drifter who had tried to sell Emma's gold watch at a local pawn shop. Hayes's involvement seemed like a clear connection to the case, but even as the team moved to apprehend him, Rivera couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. Hayes had a criminal history, but his past offenses were petty thefts, mostly involving stolen goods. He didn't fit the profile of someone who would abduct a young woman, let alone murder her. Rivera's gut told him they were missing something. Despite his reservations, Rivera pushed forward. He put out an APB for Hayes, urging local law enforcement to track him down before he disappeared again. The news of the search spread quickly, and within hours the pressure to make an arrest became unbearable. The media was calling for answers, and the community was growing restless, demanding justice for Emma. It was during this heightened tension that the arrest took place. Hayes was found holed up in a rundown motel just outside of town, trying to lay low. When officers arrived at the scene, Hayes attempted to flee, but he was quickly apprehended without incident. Rivera stood outside the motel, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. The arrest was a relief, but it also raised new questions. Why had Hayes been so quick to run? And what, if anything, did he know about Emma's fate? As Hayes was brought into custody, Rivera and his team began to piece together the details of his involvement. They questioned him for hours, trying to get him to confess. But Hayes was tight-lipped, refusing to divulge any information. His stonewalling only deepened the mystery. Why had he taken Emma's watch, and why had he been so determined to get rid of it? Was it a simple crime of opportunity, or was there a deeper connection? Despite Hayes's reluctance to speak, the investigation didn't stop. As the days passed, the evidence against him began to mount. Forensic experts had confirmed that the watch found in the pawn shop was indeed Emma's, and surveillance footage placed him near the scene of her disappearance on the night she went missing. But the breakthrough that finally cracked the case came when Rivera's team uncovered a critical piece of information. Hayes had been in contact with someone just hours before Emma's disappearance. Through a series of phone records, investigators were able to trace a call made by Hayes to a number that had been flagged by Emma's social media accounts. It was a number linked to someone Emma had been in contact with recently, someone she had met through an online group focused on criminal justice. This individual, who had been posing as a fellow student, turned out to be none other than Mark Daniels, a 32-year-old man with a history of stalking and harassment. Mark Daniels had been living under the radar, his online persona giving him the perfect cover to manipulate young women, particularly those who were interested in criminal justice. Emma had no idea that the person she had been chatting with for weeks, who had seemed like a friendly acquaintance, was a predator in disguise. Daniels had used Emma's interest to gain her trust, and once he had done so, he made his move. It became clear that Hayes wasn't the mastermind behind Emma's abduction. He had been hired as a middleman to retrieve Emma. Mark Daniels had been the one pulling the strings all along. The arrest of Hayes, though important, had only uncovered a much darker and more complicated conspiracy. Rivera's team quickly shifted focus to Daniels. With the phone records linking him to Hayes, they were able to track him down. He was found living in a small apartment in a neighboring city, and when officers arrived to arrest him, Daniels put up no fight. The arrest of Mark Daniels sent shockwaves through the community. The man who had been hiding in plain sight for so long had been manipulating everyone around him, including Emma. His calm demeanor during his arrest only added to the chilling realization that he had been preying on vulnerable women for years. As Daniels was led out of his apartment in handcuffs, Rivera couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. How had someone so close to the investigation, someone who had appeared to be just a regular person, managed to deceive so many for so long? The case that had begun as a missing persons report had turned into something much darker, revealing the true depths of human manipulation and deceit. But the arrest of Daniels was only the beginning. Rivera knew that there was still much more to uncover. Why had Daniels targeted Emma? Was there a deeper reason for her abduction, or was it simply a crime of opportunity? The search for answers continued as Rivera and his team began to delve deeper into Daniels' past. What they found was both disturbing and tragic. Daniels had been living a double life for years. He had used his fake online persona to build relationships with several young women, all of whom had been carefully selected based on their interests in criminal justice. Emma had been one of many victims. But what set her apart was her strong sense of justice, something that, in the end, may have cost her life. As Rivera began to piece together the events leading up to Emma's abduction, he learned that Daniels had been obsessed with the idea of controlling others, particularly young women. His twisted fantasies had led him to track Emma's every move, learning everything about her life, from her family to her friends, to her deepest desires. When he finally made contact with her, he saw an opportunity to fulfill his dark desires. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place as Rivera learned that Daniels had been planning Emma's abduction for weeks. He had been following her closely, studying her routine, and waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came when Emma was at the bar with her friends. Daniels had been waiting outside, watching her every move. And when she left, he made his move, following her in the dark-colored car that had been spotted on the surveillance footage. As Rivera sat in his office, reviewing the details of the case, he felt a sense of closure. The arrest of Mark Daniels had brought justice to Emma and her family. But there was a lingering sense of unease. The investigation had exposed the hidden dangers that lurked behind the innocent facades of those we trust. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of safety, and how easily someone could fall prey to the darkest corners of the human psyche. As Detective Lucas Rivera and his team delved deeper into Mark Daniels' past, they began to unravel a chilling pattern of behavior. The quiet, unassuming man who had recently been arrested for the abduction of Emma Lawson had been living a double life, one that nobody in the small town had suspected. Behind his calm demeanor and carefully constructed persona, Daniels had harbored dark, disturbing tendencies for years, tendencies that had led him to manipulate, stalk, and eventually abduct young women. The more Rivera learned about him, the more unsettling it became. Mark Daniels wasn't a stranger to the law. In fact, his criminal record, though not extensive, raised a few red flags. Daniels had a history of petty offenses, mostly involving harassment and stalking, but nothing that had ever escalated to something as serious as abduction or violence. However, what stood out was how Daniels had been able to slip under the radar for so long. His crimes had always been small, insidious in nature, never enough to raise alarms, but always leaving a trail of disturbed victims in his wake. Rivera learned that Daniels had been living in the town for over 5 years, but his background was riddled with secrets. Originally from a small town in the neighboring state, Daniels had moved to Florida to escape a past that seemed to follow him wherever he went. His family had little to say about him, other than vague comments about his troubled youth. He had grown up in a broken home with a father who had been distant and a mother who had struggled with her own issues. Daniels's relationship with his parents had been strained, marked by years of emotional neglect. There had been little to no contact with his family after he moved away, and his few acquaintances in Florida described him as an introvert, a man who kept to himself and rarely socialized. This lack of familial connection, combined with Daniels's desire for control, seemed to fuel his twisted behavior. He had few friends in town, most of whom he had manipulated into believing he was a harmless, well-meaning individual. But there was always something off about him. He had a way of charming people, making them feel comfortable and safe, all while hiding his true nature. Rivera and his team dug deeper into Daniels's online activities, where they uncovered something even more disturbing. Daniels had been active on several online forums, particularly those that discussed criminal justice and the psychology of offenders. He had used these platforms to present himself as someone passionate about the law, often commenting on cases and sharing his own expert opinions. He had built an entire online identity around this persona, one of a dedicated, aspiring criminologist. But the truth, as Rivera soon discovered, was far darker. Daniels had become obsessed with the idea of criminal control. He viewed himself as a sort of mastermind, someone who could manipulate and control those around him for his own twisted satisfaction. His fascination with the human psyche had evolved from a benign interest in psychology to a dangerous obsession with power and dominance. This obsession had led him to engage with vulnerable young women online, including Emma. Daniels had carefully selected his victims based on their interest in criminal justice, using his knowledge of their passions to gain their trust and build a false relationship. As Rivera reviewed the messages between Daniels and Emma, it became clear how well Daniels had played his role. He had posed as someone who shared her ambitions, offering her advice and discussing criminal cases in detail. Emma had no reason to suspect that the man she was conversing with had ulterior motives. Daniels had become the perfect predator, charming, knowledgeable, and always just a little too interested in her life. His manipulation had been subtle, slowly eroding her boundaries until she was comfortable enough to meet him in person. Rivera learned that Daniels's past was littered with signs of this same behavior. In previous towns where he had lived, there had been reports of young women who had mysteriously cut off contact with him after strange interactions. But none of these incidents had been serious enough to warrant a full investigation. Daniels had always been able to escape detection by walking the fine line between socially awkward and manipulative. The more Rivera dug into Daniels's history, the more he realized that this wasn't just the work of a lone individual. This was the culmination of years of twisted behavior, building up to the abduction of Emma Lawson. It wasn't until Rivera discovered Daniels's extensive collection of journals that the full extent of his dark mind became clear. Daniels had kept detailed records of his interactions with young women, documenting his feelings of control and the satisfaction he derived from manipulating them. His journal entries revealed a chilling pattern. Each woman he targeted was carefully chosen, based on her vulnerabilities and her desires to pursue a career in criminal justice. Daniels viewed these women as nothing more than pawns in a game of psychological manipulation. And in Emma he had found his perfect victim. The journals were a damning piece of evidence. In them, Daniels had described in great detail the thrill he felt when he was able to manipulate someone into trusting him completely. His obsession with Emma had been growing for months. He had even started planning their first meeting, studying her social media posts to learn about her interests and her daily routine. Daniels had carefully orchestrated the events that led to her abduction, using his knowledge of criminal behavior to make her feel safe and unthreatened. As Rivera continued to uncover the depths of Daniels's disturbing mindset, he began to realize that Emma had been much more than just a victim. She had been a pawn in a twisted game that Daniels had been playing for years. But as the investigation moved forward, Rivera's anger began to boil over. How had Daniels been able to fly under the radar for so long? How had he manipulated so many women without anyone noticing the signs? With Daniels's background fully revealed, Rivera knew the next step was to confront him in an interrogation room. The arrest had been a victory, but the real battle would be getting Daniels to confess, to uncover the full extent of his plans and to bring justice to Emma and the other women he had preyed upon. Rivera couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of a much darker truth. Daniels's arrest was just the beginning. As Rivera prepared for the interrogation, he knew that the answers they sought were still locked inside Daniels's mind. The chilling reality was clear. Mark Daniels had been living a lie for years, carefully hiding his true nature from the world, until Emma Lawson's disappearance had forced him into the open. The small town of Florida, once calm and quiet, now found itself at the center of a storm. The arrest of Mark Daniels had sent shockwaves through the community, and now the long-awaited trial was about to begin. It was a case that had captivated the entire nation, the trial of the man who had abducted and manipulated Emma Lawson. The courtroom was filled with tension as the victim's family, the local community, and the press gathered to witness the proceedings that would finally bring the truth to light. The trial began on a crisp fall morning, with a palpable sense of unease hanging in the air. Emma's mother, Karen Lawson, was seated in the front row, her eyes red from sleepless nights and the constant grief of losing her daughter. She had waited for this moment for so long, and yet, as the trial began, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. Would they get the justice Emma deserved? Or was this just another chapter in a never-ending nightmare? Mark Daniels entered the courtroom, his face impassive, his eyes scanning the room as he took his seat. The man who had once been the charming, quiet individual in their community was now a defendant on trial for his life. His demeanor was calm, even composed, but there was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. He seemed almost indifferent to the gravity of the charges against him. The contrast between the victim's devastated family and Daniels's cold detachment was stark, and it sent a chill through the room. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Ana Perez, a seasoned lawyer who had built a reputation for her aggressive and relentless pursuit of justice. She knew the stakes were high and she had one goal: to ensure Mark Daniels was held accountable for the horror he had inflicted on Emma and her family. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but Perez knew that securing a conviction would require more than just presenting facts. It would require peeling back the layers of Daniels's deception and exposing his true nature to the jury. The first few days of the trial were filled with testimony from law enforcement officers who had worked tirelessly on the case. They presented evidence, including the phone records linking Daniels to Hayes, the pawn shop surveillance footage, and the journals found in Daniels's apartment. The prosecution painted a clear picture of a man who had meticulously planned Emma's abduction, someone who had carefully manipulated and stalked her before making his move. The case seemed straightforward. Daniels had abducted Emma, held her captive, and caused irreparable harm. But the defense, led by attorney Richard Brooks, was not backing down. Brooks was a seasoned lawyer, known for his ability to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors. He argued that there was no direct evidence linking Daniels to Emma's disappearance, and he questioned the validity of the phone records and the pawn shop evidence. He tried to undermine the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial at best. Brooks's primary strategy, however, was to focus on Mark Daniels's mental state. He painted Daniels as a troubled man, someone who had been the victim of a difficult childhood and a series of misfortunes that had led him down a dark path. Brooks argued that Daniels's actions, while horrific, were the result of years of unresolved trauma and mental instability. The defense claimed that Daniels was not fully aware of the consequences of his actions, that he had acted under the influence of psychological issues that had gone unaddressed for years. The prosecution countered this argument by bringing in expert witnesses who testified about Daniels's behavior. Dr. Sarah Fields, a renowned psychologist specializing in criminal behavior, was called to the stand to explain the psychology behind Daniels's actions. She testified that Daniels had shown clear signs of premeditated intent. He had carefully chosen his victims, stalked them, and manipulated them into trusting him. Dr. Fields argued that Daniels's actions were not the result of a mental illness but rather a calculated decision to assert power and control over others. She described him as a predator who knew exactly what he was doing. His manipulation of Emma was not the result of mental instability, but of a deep-rooted desire to dominate and control. As the trial progressed, the emotional toll on Emma's family became more apparent. Karen Lawson was forced to relive the traumatic events surrounding her daughter's disappearance, and every testimony, Every piece of evidence seemed to reopen the wound. She sat in silence, her face a mask of grief and fury, as the defense tried to portray Daniels as a victim of circumstances. The juxtaposition of the pain and suffering of Emma's family with Danielle's cold and calculated demeanor only made the trial more intense. Throughout the trial, the jury listened intently to the testimony, carefully weighing the evidence. The prosecution's case was strong, but the defense's tactics were causing some doubts. By the time both sides had rested their cases, the jury had been exposed to a range of emotions: anger, sorrow, disbelief, but the most important question remained: was Mark Daniels guilty of kidnapping and harming Emma Lawson, or had the prosecution failed to prove its case? The closing arguments were delivered with the kind of fervor and passion that Rivera had come to expect from District Attorney Ana Perez. She stood before the jury, her voice steady but filled with emotion as she described the horrific impact of Danielle's actions. She spoke of Emma's life, her hopes, her dreams, and the bright future that had been taken from her. Mark Daniels didn't just steal Emma's future, Perez said, her voice rising. He stole the very essence of who she was, and he did so with cold, calculated intent. He is not the victim in this case. Emma was the victim. And her family will never be the same again. On the other side, Richard Brooks attempted to sow doubt. He reminded the jury of the lack of concrete, direct evidence tying Daniels to Emma's abduction. What we have here, he said, is a case built on circumstantial evidence and assumptions. Mark Daniels is not the monster they want you to believe he is. He is a man who was deeply troubled, and the tragic events that occurred were the result of a life lived in turmoil. After the closing arguments, the jury was instructed to deliberate. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Everyone, from the Lawson family to the press and the spectators, waited with bated breath. The hours seemed to stretch into eternity as the jury carefully considered the evidence. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned with their verdict. The room fell silent as the judge prepared to read the decision. We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Daniels, guilty of kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and assault causing bodily harm, the foreman declared. A wave of relief washed over the Lawson family. Tears streamed down Karen's face as she clutched the hand of her husband. The guilty verdict was a victory, but it was bittersweet. No sentence, no amount of justice could bring Emma back, but at least her family now knew the truth. Mark Daniels was led away in handcuffs, his face impassive as the courtroom erupted in whispers and quiet sobs. For Detective Rivera and the rest of the law enforcement team, the case had come to an end. They had brought a dangerous predator to justice, but the emotional scars left by Danielle's actions would linger in the community for years to come. The courtroom was silent as Mark Daniels was led away in handcuffs, his face expressionless. But in the rows of spectators, there was no mistaking the deep sense of relief that washed over Emma Lawson's family. For Karen Lawson, Emma's mother, the conviction of Mark Daniels brought an overwhelming sense of finality, though it couldn't erase the pain of losing her daughter. The court's decision was a victory, but one that came with a bittersweet price. The price of a life that would never be the same. As the family left the courtroom that day, the weight of the verdict hung heavy in the air. The long months of uncertainty, the endless hours spent waiting for justice, had finally come to an end. But the emotional toll on Karen and her husband, Robert, was evident. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph. Only a quiet acknowledgement that, while the man responsible for Emma's abduction had been brought to justice, the absence of their daughter would forever cast a shadow over their lives. Karen had been Emma's rock, her biggest cheerleader. She had been the one to encourage Emma to follow her dreams, to pursue her passion for criminal justice. But now, in the wake of the trial, Karen found herself struggling to find a sense of purpose. Every corner of their home felt empty without Emma's presence. Her daughter's laughter, once so vibrant, was now only a memory, replayed in the quiet moments when Karen found herself alone with her thoughts. Will we ever be whole again? Karen often asked herself, her heart aching with the weight of loss. The question was one that had no answer. She had hoped for so long that Emma would return to her arms, but the reality was too harsh to bear. Emma was gone, and though the guilty verdict was a step toward closure, it didn't fill the void she had left behind. Robert, Emma's father, struggled with his own form of grief. He had always been the strong one, the protector of the family, but this tragedy had shattered him in ways he didn't know how to articulate. He had kept his emotions locked away for months, focusing on the trial and the search for justice. But now that it was over, the floodgates had opened. At night, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape the images of Emma's smile, her gentle spirit, and the way she had always known how to make him laugh. The trial had forced Robert to confront the reality of what had happened to his daughter, and the pain was unbearable. "I should have protected her," he would say, his voice filled with regret. "I should have known something was wrong." But the truth was, no one had known. No one had suspected that the charming, seemingly harmless man who had ingratiated himself into their community was capable of such monstrosity. Mark Daniels had carefully concealed his dark desires behind a mask of normalcy, and it was only after Emma's abduction that the truth had come to light. For Robert, it was a painful reminder that there were some things beyond his control, and no amount of protection could have shielded Emma from the horrors that befell her. As the months passed, Karen and Robert found themselves grappling with the reality of their new lives. They were forever marked by the loss of Emma, and no amount of justice could undo the damage that had been done. The grief, though somewhat alleviated by the conviction, remained a constant companion. They were haunted by the unanswered questions. Why Emma? Why their family? And what had driven Mark Daniels to commit such a heinous crime? The community, too, was deeply affected by the trial and the eventual conviction. Florida, a small, tight-knit town, had been shaken to its core. For years, residents had felt a sense of security, believing that the peaceful nature of their town could shield them from the violence and tragedy that so often gripped larger cities. But the case of Emma Lawson had shattered that illusion. The residents had known Emma, had seen her grow up, and now, they were left to grapple with the unsettling truth that evil could exist even in the most unsuspecting places. The impact on the community was profound, with many residents struggling to come to terms with what had happened. The trial, though a source of closure for Emma's family, had left the town in a state of shock. The once peaceful streets now seemed empty, as if the tragedy had cast a shadow over everything. People who had once known Emma as the vibrant, kind young woman she had been now found themselves questioning the safety of their own homes, wondering how someone so insidious could have lived among them without detection. But despite the community's collective sorrow, there was a sense of unity that emerged in the aftermath. Emma's story had ignited conversations about the dangers of manipulation, about the predators who hide in plain sight, and the importance of teaching young people how to protect themselves from the dangers of the world. Local schools began to implement new programs focused on teaching students about safe online interactions and recognizing the signs of manipulation. The community rallied together, determined to honor Emma's memory by ensuring that her story would not be forgotten. For Karen and Robert, the journey toward healing was slow and fraught with emotional turmoil. They had lost their daughter, and no trial, no verdict could bring her back. But as they worked through their grief, they found strength in each other and in the love they had for Emma. They began to channel their pain into advocacy, speaking out about the dangers of online predators and the importance of supporting families affected by abductions. Though the road ahead was long, Karen and Robert knew they had to keep Emma's memory alive, not just for their own sake, but for the sake of others who might find themselves in a similar situation. Through it all, Emma's memory remained a guiding light for her parents. They knew their daughter's legacy would live on, not just in the justice that had been served, but in the changes that were being made to protect future generations. Emma had wanted to make a difference in the world, to fight for justice, and even in death she had succeeded. Her story, though tragic, had sparked a movement that would help others avoid the horrors she had faced. As the final verdict of Mark Daniels's trial was delivered, there was a palpable sense of relief that swept over Emma Lawson's family. The months of anxiety, of waiting for justice, had come to an end. But even with the resolution of the trial, the sense of closure was elusive. Karen and Robert Lawson had spent months in a fog of grief and confusion, struggling to comprehend the brutality of what had happened to their daughter. Justice had been served, but the damage done to their family would never be undone. Mark Daniels had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His conviction had been a testament to the perseverance of Detective Rivera, the strength of Emma's family, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. But as Daniels was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Karen's heart sank. The satisfaction of a guilty verdict was fleeting, swallowed by the deep ache of knowing that her daughter was gone. There would be no more birthdays, no more laughter echoing through the house, no more shared moments between mother and daughter. The pain was not something that could be healed by a court ruling or a sentence. Emma was lost, and no amount of justice could bring her back. The months following the trial were a time of both reflection and continued grief for the Lawson family. While the conviction of Daniels had brought an official end to the legal battle, the emotional journey was far from over. The ripple effect of Emma's disappearance had changed everything. Karen found herself re-evaluating her life, her relationships, and her role as a mother. She had always been protective of Emma, guiding her through the ups and downs of life. But no amount of protection had been enough to shield her daughter from the horrific actions of Mark Daniels. The guilt of not having been able to keep Emma safe weighed heavily on her. Robert, too, struggled with his feelings of inadequacy. He had always prided himself on being the protector of the family, the one who could shield his loved ones from harm. But in the face of such evil, he had felt powerless. The question of "why didn't I protect her?" haunted him at every turn. He tried to keep his emotions in check, but the loss of Emma had cracked something deep within him. The man who had once been the pillar of strength for his family now found himself broken in ways he didn't know how to fix. Despite their individual struggles, Karen and Robert found strength in one another. They leaned on each other in ways they never had before. Together, they began the slow and painful process of rebuilding their lives. They knew that they could never return to the way things had been before Emma's disappearance, but they were determined to keep her memory alive. One of the first steps in their healing journey was to create a foundation in Emma's name. The Emma Lawson Foundation would be dedicated to helping families affected by abductions and providing resources to help raise awareness about online safety. Karen and Robert threw themselves into the cause, finding solace in knowing that their daughter's legacy could make a difference. Though the pain of losing Emma would never fully subside, they found a sense of purpose in continuing the work that their daughter had so passionately believed in. The foundation quickly gained traction in the community. Local schools, churches, and community centers all joined in, helping to spread the message about protecting young people from online predators. The foundation's outreach programs became a vital resource for parents, children, and law enforcement, offering everything from safety seminars to resources on how to recognize the signs of manipulation and control. What had once been a nightmare for Karen and Robert had now become a force for good, helping others avoid the pain that had shattered their world. Through their work with the foundation, Karen and Robert were able to connect with other families who had suffered similar tragedies. They found strength in these relationships, offering support to those who were going through the same unbearable pain. The shared understanding of loss created a bond that no one else could truly comprehend. In helping others, Karen and Robert began to heal in ways they hadn't thought possible. As the years passed, the Lawson family found a new rhythm, though it was one marked by a lingering sadness. Holidays and anniversaries were always difficult, and Emma's absence was felt deeply at every family gathering. But the foundation they had built in her memory became a beacon of hope, and it allowed them to channel their grief into something positive. Emma had wanted to make a difference in the world, and even in death she had done just that. For Detective Rivera, the case of Emma Lawson remained one of the most impactful in his career. The conviction of Mark Daniels had been a victory, but it had come at a steep price. The lasting impact of Emma's abduction on her family and the community was something Rivera would never forget. In his mind, the case was a reminder of the darkness that could hide behind seemingly normal facades. It was a reminder of the importance of vigilance and the need to protect those who could not protect themselves. Rivera stayed in touch with Karen and Robert over the years, offering support whenever needed. He knew that no matter how much time passed, Emma's absence would always be felt. But he also knew that they had found a way to honor her, a way to keep her spirit alive. The pursuit of justice had been a long and difficult road, but it had led to the conviction of a dangerous man, and more importantly, it had given Emma's family a sense of purpose in a world that often felt cruel and unforgiving. The town of Florida, once a quiet, peaceful place where everyone knew each other, had forever changed in the wake of Emma Lawson's abduction and the subsequent trial of Mark Daniels. Though the case had been resolved, the emotional scars left behind would linger for years to come. For Karen and Robert Lawson, justice had been served, but the void created by the loss of their daughter could never be filled. The finality of the trial, the sentencing, and the guilty verdict brought them no true comfort, for the most important piece of the puzzle, their daughter, was still gone. In the days following the trial, there were moments of reflection for everyone involved. The victims, the investigators, the community. It seemed as though everyone had been touched by the tragedy in some way. For Karen and Robert, the pain of Emma's death was still raw, and they often found themselves grappling with feelings of disbelief. How could someone they had known, someone who had blended so seamlessly into their lives, commit such a heinous act? The more they learned about Mark Daniels, the more they realized that he had been hiding in plain sight, operating under a false identity, using charm and manipulation to conceal his true intentions. Despite their grief, Karen and Robert found themselves more determined than ever to keep Emma's memory alive. They poured their energy into the Emma Lawson Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping families affected by abductions and raising awareness about the dangers of online predators. The foundation became their lifeline, a way for them to channel their pain into something positive. Emma's passion for justice had sparked a movement, and though she could never benefit from it, her legacy was something that would help protect others for generations to come. The foundation's reach expanded beyond Florida, touching lives across the country. Schools, community centers, and local law enforcement agencies collaborated with the foundation to provide education and resources for parents and children on how to recognize the signs of manipulation and control. Emma's story became a powerful tool for raising awareness about the dangers that lurked in the digital world, dangers that many parents like Karen and Robert had never even considered before. The emotional toll of the case weighed heavily on Detective Rivera as well. He had been the one to find the critical evidence, to lead the investigation, and to bring Mark Daniels to justice, but the shadows of the case followed him long after the trial ended. The case had been a reminder of the darkest aspects of human nature, the ability to deceive, to manipulate, and to cause harm. Even now, as he looked back on the case, Rivera couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. How many other victims were out there, hidden in plain sight, unaware of the dangers around them? In the aftermath of the case, Rivera had reached out to Karen and Robert on several occasions, offering his support as they navigated their new reality. The work of solving the case was done, but the emotional work of healing had only just begun. Rivera had learned over the years that justice, while important, was not always enough to heal the wounds of the heart. For Karen and Robert, their daughter's death would always haunt them. No amount of retribution, no matter how just, could undo the damage done. As the years went on, the Lawson family slowly began to rebuild their lives, though they would never be the same. Karen found herself in a place where she could talk about Emma without breaking down in tears, but the pain of losing her daughter never truly subsided. Robert, too, found moments of peace, though there was always a lingering sadness in his eyes. Together, they had found strength in their shared grief, and in the legacy they had built in Emma's name. But their journey was one of continual reflection, a constant balancing act between honoring Emma's memory and trying to heal from the irreparable loss. Mark Daniels remained in prison, serving his life sentence, but in the minds of many, the true punishment had already been served. His life, once filled with promise and potential, had been stripped away by his own actions. He was a man forever defined by his dark choices, and in the end, his manipulation had led him down a path from which there was no return. As for the town of Florida, the case had left an indelible mark on the community. The once peaceful streets, now lined with the weight of a collective tragedy, would forever be changed. People spoke of Emma with reverence, remembering her as the bright, vibrant young woman who had been taken too soon. Her friends and family carried her memory with them, honoring her in small ways, through the foundation, through the stories they shared, through the changes they had made to protect others. Emma had become more than just a victim. She had become a symbol of resilience, of the strength to fight for justice even in the face of the unimaginable. And so, as the years passed, the story of Emma Lawson's abduction and the trial that followed remained a testament to the power of justice, the depth of grief, and the strength of a family that refused to let their daughter's legacy fade into the darkness. Emma's life, though cut short, had made a difference. And in that difference, Karen and Robert found a sense of purpose. A reminder that, no matter how deep the pain, they had the ability to turn their tragedy into something that would help others. Though Emma was gone, she would never be forgotten.